In 1986, the Soviet Union sent roughly 600,000 people to Chernobyl. Soldiers, miners, civilian workers ordered onto ground that was so radioactive that the machines sent to clear it broke down within minutes. So humans replaced them. They were called bio-robots, given lead aprons and 90 seconds on the reactor roof before their bodies absorbed more radiation than most people receive in a lifetime. These men helped prevent a catastrophe that could have contaminated much of Europe. Then, one by one, their names began to disappear from the record. This is what it cost to be one of them. The Chernobyl cleanup was not the work of a small, specialized team. It was a mass mobilization that drew in nearly 600,000 people from across the Soviet Union. Soldiers made up almost half of that number, many of them reservists or conscripts, assigned by decree and often with little warning. Alongside them were miners, engineers, firefighters, medical staff, and civilian specialists. Each group pressed into service under the same urgent command: contain the radioactive aftermath at any cost. This workforce arrived in waves. Firefighters and emergency responders entered the reactor building within hours of the explosion. Military units were dispatched to decontaminate the grounds, construct barriers, and clear debris. Civilian engineers and plant technicians stayed on to stabilize the reactor and build the concrete sarcophagus. In May 1986, thousands of miners tunneled beneath Reactor 4 to prevent a second catastrophe. Medical teams set up field hospitals and treated radiation injuries in makeshift wards. Volunteers and construction crews filled the gaps, often with little more training than a briefing and a uniform. The scale was staggering. Some estimates place the total number of liquidators as high as 800,000, though the most widely cited figure remains 600,000. The operation was coordinated through military channels, but the reality was chaotic. Assignments changed daily, records were incomplete, and the lines between soldier and civilian blurred. Each person entered the exclusion zone with a different background, but all faced the same invisible threat. To understand what this meant in human terms, the story narrows to the experience of one representative liquidator. His path stands in for the hundreds of thousands who worked, suffered, and disappeared from the record. The question is not only how the disaster was contained, but what it looked and felt like to be part of the force that bore its weight. Orders arrived without warning. The assignment was delivered as a military decree. It was impersonal, stamped, and final. There was no discussion of risk or reward, only a date, a reporting location, and the expectation of immediate compliance. For the chosen liquidator, the summons meant leaving home within hours, surrendering civilian clothes for the plain uniform of a mobilized reservist. Personal effects were limited to a small bag. Identification documents were collected and sealed away. From this point on, his name was a line on a roster, his fate tied to a unit number and a mission he did not choose. The briefing itself was brief. Officers outlined the essentials: destination, unit composition, and the chain of command. No one explained the full extent of the danger. The word radiation was mentioned only in passing. Instructions focused on discipline, punctuality, and obedience. There was no time for detailed preparation. Protective gear, if issued at all, was distributed at the staging area near the exclusion zone. Most men received only standard-issue uniforms, boots, and a respirator. Some were handed a lead-lined vest or a dosimeter badge, but many were sent in with nothing but a helmet and a paper mask. Movement to the disaster site was arranged by military transport, trucks, buses, and trains packed with conscripts and volunteers. Windows remained closed, and the mood was tense. Conversation was sparse. The landscape grew emptier as the convoy approached the cordoned-off zone. Checkpoints became more frequent. Armed guards reviewed orders and rosters. Each stop reinforced the sense of separation from ordinary life. Upon arrival, the liquidator was directed to a barracks, temporary, crowded, and stripped of comfort. Briefings continued, but always in the language of duty. The mission was framed as a necessary act to protect the country. There were no promises of safety, only the assurance that the work had to be done. With little preparation and no real understanding of what lay ahead, the Liquidator waited for the first orders to enter the heart of the disaster. The roof of Reactor 4 was a wasteland of shattered graphite, twisted metal, and chunks of radioactive fuel. Every piece had to be cleared by hand. The heat from the core still radiated upward, but the real threat was invisible, gamma rays that could kill in minutes. Machines sent ahead had failed, their circuits fried by radiation, so men were ordered up in their place. The Liquidator's task was simple: run onto the roof, shovel debris into waiting chutes, and get out before the dosimeter's alarm signaled it was too late. Each rotation lasted only 90 seconds. The time was calculated not for comfort or efficiency, but to keep the accumulated dose just below the threshold, known to cause acute radiation sickness. At the measured dose rates, sometimes exceeding 10,000 Roentgens per hour, 90 seconds delivered a dose of about 0.2 to 0.25 Gray. In plain terms, that is more than 100 times the annual limit for a nuclear worker, absorbed in less than 2 minutes. Any longer, and the risk of irreversible damage to bone marrow, blood, and internal organs spiked sharply. The stopwatch was the only real protection. Seconds stretched and warped, each one felt in the lungs and limbs as the body raced against an enemy it could not sense. Survivors remember the sensation, the sharp, metallic taste in the mouth, the burning on exposed skin, the panic of knowing that every breath, every moment on the roof, was measured in future sickness. One described it as running through a sandstorm of burning graphite, eyes watering, shoveling blindly, while the dosimeter ticked louder and louder. There was no time to think, only to move, sprint to the pile, scoop and toss, then retreat down the ladder as the next man took his place. The gear was basic: uniform, boots, a helmet, sometimes a respirator. Most had no dosimeter of their own, relying on a supervisor's stopwatch and a shouted command to get off the roof. The graphite fragments were not just debris. Some pieces glowed faintly, hot to the touch, each one a concentrated source of gamma and beta radiation. The men worked with whatever tools they could carry: shovels, spades, sometimes their bare hands. There was no margin for error. A stumble, a delay, or a jammed chute could mean the difference between going home with a headache and vomiting blood by nightfall. The shift logbooks recorded each man's time on the roof and the calculated dose. The numbers were cold, precise, and final. Most liquidators were allowed only 1 or 2 such shifts before being reassigned. Yet even a single rotation could be enough to cause lasting harm. The system was blunt: keep the dose just below the line, then send in the next. The risk was distributed across thousands of bodies, each one bearing a fraction of the disaster's invisible weight. For the Liquidator, the 90 seconds on the roof became a lifetime's memory, the moment when duty, fear, and the limits of human endurance collided under the shadow of the ruined reactor. The protective gear issued to liquidators was a compromise between urgency and physical possibility. Standard uniforms offered no real barrier against gamma radiation, so Soviet planners turned to lead aprons, heavy, rigid, and designed for brief tasks in controlled environments, not frantic sprints across a radioactive rooftop. Each apron weighed up to 15 kilograms, hanging like an iron vest across the shoulders and chest. The lead panel shielded the torso, but the head, neck, arms, and legs remained exposed. In theory, the apron could cut a portion of the gamma dose, especially from lower energy fragments. In practice, the most dangerous rays passed through or around the shield, and the added weight slowed every movement. Survivors described the sensation as carrying a furnace on the back, sweat pooling beneath the straps, muscles burning after only seconds of work. The gear was both reassurance and burden, visible proof that something was being done, but no guarantee of safety. Official guidelines called for lead protection in zones above 2 sieverts per hour, yet the roof's dose rates often exceeded even those thresholds. For the Liquidator, the apron was a reminder: protection was partial, the danger absolute, and the work had to be finished regardless of the shield's limits. Remote-controlled machines arrived first. The STR-1 robot, a hulking six-wheeled platform armored in lead, was designed to do what no human could: clear radioactive debris from the reactor roof without risking a single life. But the radiation was too intense. Electronic circuits failed within minutes. Imported German and Japanese robots built for industrial work lasted even less time. Their wiring burned out, control signals vanished, and some machines simply stalled in place, immobilized by the invisible assault. Soviet engineers tried to shield the electronics with thicker lead, but nothing could withstand the gamma fields pouring from the graphite and fuel fragments. Every attempt at technological rescue ended the same way: a dead machine stranded in the radioactive wasteland above Reactor 4. With the robots defeated, command turned to people. The term bio-robot entered the official vocabulary, a euphemism for men sent in to do what machines could not. Human bodies became the fallback solution, measured in seconds and sieverts. The Liquidator, like thousands of others, was ordered onto the roof with a shovel and a stopwatch, his own flesh now the expendable tool of last resort. Elsewhere, the cleanup front kept expanding. Underground, miners from the Donbass and Tula coalfields dug a tunnel beneath the reactor, working in suffocating heat and dust to build a cooling barrier that might prevent a second explosion. Their exposure was different, less intense than the rooftop, but spread over weeks in cramped, unventilated shafts. Decontamination teams, meanwhile, scraped topsoil, washed buildings, and sprayed chemicals across the exclusion zone, each task carrying its own risks and uncertainties. The operation sprawled across every surface and layer of the disaster site. No matter the job, the pattern held. When machines failed or protection ran thin, it was human hands that carried the burden, and human bodies that paid the price. Symptoms began to appear before the dust had settled. Within hours of leaving the roof, the Liquidator felt a wave of nausea that would not subside. A metallic taste clung to the mouth, and a pounding headache set in, joined by a rising fever. These were not ordinary signs of exhaustion. They were the first stage of acute radiation sickness, the body's immediate, involuntary response to a dose that far exceeded what any civilian or soldier was meant to endure. Vomiting often came in the first 30 minutes, sometimes sooner. Skin reddened as if sunburned from within. Diarrhea followed, along with chills and a deep, unshakable fatigue. In the barracks and field hospitals, men lay on cots, shivering and sweating, their symptoms catalogued by doctors who recognized the pattern from medical texts, but rarely from experience. Blood tests revealed a sharp drop in white cells and platelets, a sign that the marrow itself was failing. Hair began to fall out in clumps by the end of the first week. Acute radiation sickness unfolds in phases. The initial shock gives way to a brief period of apparent recovery, but inside the body, damage spreads. Infection risk soars as the immune system collapses. For some, the illness advanced quickly, leading to bleeding, sepsis, and organ failure. Even those who seemed to recover faced weeks or months of uncertainty. The danger did not end when the shift ended. It lingered in the blood, the bones, and the memory, a silent consequence of minutes spent on the roof. Hospital admission became the next chapter in the Liquidator's ordeal. The symptoms that began on the roof, including vomiting, fever, and relentless fatigue, were now catalogued by doctors in a medical file. Each entry in the chart marked a new stage. Blood counts dropping, hair shedding in clumps, skin turning red and raw. The hospital's isolation wards, built for infectious disease, now served as containment for radiation exposure. Beds filled with men from the exclusion zone, each separated from family and from one another, their names replaced by case numbers and initials. Treatment protocols followed a strict routine. Blood draws, transfusions, antibiotics, and anti-nausea injections arrived in sequence, recorded in careful handwriting. Bone marrow transplants were attempted for the most severe cases, overseen by hematologists who had trained for war wounds, not radiation. The staff worked behind masks and gloves, aware that no barrier could stop what had already entered the body. Visitors were forbidden. The only contact came through leaded glass or hurried notes passed by nurses. The medical file grew heavier with each day. White blood cell counts fell, platelets dropped, and secondary infections set in. The evidence was undeniable, written in numbers and clinical observations rather than rumors or speculation. The hospital record became a second kind of proof, a parallel to the original work order, but now documenting the cost paid in flesh and blood. Even as some patients stabilized, others slipped away, their decline measured not in stories, but in the unblinking language of medicine. The end of active cleanup did not bring closure for the liquidators. Recognition from the state arrived slowly, if at all. Many workers returned home with only a vague certificate or a stamped discharge paper, documents that would later prove essential, yet often went missing or were never issued. The Soviet government began issuing compensation laws in the early 1990s, but the process was riddled with obstacles. Pension files show repeated cases where a liquidator's name appeared on a brigade roster, but the corresponding service record was missing or incomplete. Letters from the Ukrainian State Registry of Pensioners cite insufficient documentation as grounds for denial, even when the individual could point to contemporaneous news photographs or badge numbers. Medal logs reveal that out of hundreds of thousands mobilized, only about 250,000 received the official liquidator medal. Many entries in these registers are blank, redacted, or list only a badge number with no name attached. For some, acknowledgement arrived decades after the fact. For others, it never came at all. The bureaucracy that once depended on these men to avert disaster later demanded proof that was impossible to provide. The story is preserved in files and fragments: a denied pension, a missing medal, a name crossed out on a faded roster. The cost of service lingered long after the radiation subsided, measured not only in illness, but in the silence that followed. Official records from the Chernobyl cleanup are filled with gaps, rows of blank spaces where names should appear, badge numbers with no corresponding identity, and rosters struck through with red ink. In the files of the State Archive and the Chernobyl Museum, brigade lists often end mid-page, with entire groups left unrecorded. Medal registers, intended to honor service, list only a fraction of those who stood on the roof or tunneled beneath the reactor. Out of hundreds of thousands mobilized, only about 250,000 received the Liquidator medal. For many, there is no surviving proof of their assignment, no dosimeter log, no pension file, only the memory of a number on a lost roster. Letters from pension authorities cite insufficient documentation as grounds for denial, even when photographs or eyewitness accounts confirm a liquidator's presence. The archive becomes a place where omission hardens into history, and the names of those who risked everything begin to vanish from the official story. The representative liquidator, like so many others, is left to be recovered from fragments, a faded photograph, a crossed-out entry, or a medal without a name. Their sacrifice helped save millions, yet the record often preserves only the outline of their labor, not the dignity of their names. Today, tens of thousands of Chernobyl liquidators live with chronic illness, while most remain unnamed in official records. Their ordeal stands as a warning. When disaster strikes, it is often ordinary people who pay the highest price. They then vanish from history. As the world debates nuclear safety, their silent sacrifice demands remembrance. Some debts, measured in lives, can never be repaid.